Welcome to the Fear and Greed Weekend Edition, the week that was, a wrap of the biggest stories over the past 7 days. I'm Sean Aylmer. Well, it was a big week for share markets, for COVID, the government, rich executives, and Kim Jong-un. It was the week that share markets finally came off the boil. Wall Street, European markets, and the ASX 200 all dropped during the week. There's a couple of things happening. Investors are worried about the jump in COVID cases globally. In the US, in some states, numbers are up. Same deal in the United Kingdom. Poster-child countries like Israel and Singapore are experiencing a resurgence, mostly among unvaccinated citizens. That's triggered fears that the economic rebound won't be quite as strong as expected. Also, central banks from Europe to the United States and Australia talked about reducing bond purchases this week. Traders took that as a sign that the mindset was changing among central bankers. And one of the key reasons equity markets are still running, even though they are relatively expensive in historical terms, is because monetary and fiscal policy are both very, very easy. The very same concerns pared back oil prices during the week. Gold also came back. Iron ore prices kept falling towards $130 a tonne, but gas and coal prices are surging. As a result, electricity prices are sky high. The Aussie dollar had a net fall over the week, but pretty much remained around that 74 US cent mark. It was a very big week for international news. There are growing calls led by the World Health Organization for rich countries to provide vaccines to poor countries. Unless everyone is vaccinated, COVID will continue to mutate and spread in rich and poor countries. So it's in the world's interest for all countries to be inoculated. Instead, the rich countries are generally now debating when to introduce booster jabs, while the poor countries are begging for help with their first shots. Chinese regulators this week called in gaming companies, including Tencent Holdings, and told them to de-emphasize profits. What an odd concept. Perhaps I'm a little too capitalistic for China. Beijing wants the gaming groups to break from pursuing profit and to think more about preventing kids from being addicted to games. Good luck with that. El Salvador became the first country to accept Bitcoin as legal tender. The launch didn't quite go to plan, with the digital currency down as much as 17% to $43,000 a unit after the government had to take its app for storing the digital currency offline due to capacity issues. The Taliban formed its first caretaker government since taking control of Afghanistan at the end of last month. And what a rogues gallery. Several members of the new government have been targets of sanctions for terrorism, while the Interior Minister is on the United Nations Most Wanted list. And staying on the theme, Kim Jong-un, the idiosyncratic leader of North Korea, this week appeared in public for the first time in a while, looking slimmer and tanned. According to South Korea's National Spy Agency, Kim weighed 136 kilos last November. He certainly is less than that now. Perhaps the food shortages in North Korea, brought on by sanctions because of Kim's nuclear ambitions, are reaching the highest levels. In local news, there was plenty of environmental news this week. The United Nations top climate advisor said Australia had less than a decade to transition out of coal under a plan that would eliminate the industry by 2030. If not, climate change will wreak havoc across the economy, from agriculture to tourism and across the services sector. Also, this week the banking regulator called on the big banks to carefully manage climate change risks and improve risk management around the issue. Oil and gas giant Santos said it was looking at carbon capture from the air and storing it underground in its carbon capture facility in South Australia. It's also considering green hydrogen. And Treasury Wine Estates said its operations globally will be powered by renewable energy by 2024. Every day there's a new story about climate change. It's now part of the mainstream, and the federal government's refusal to commit to an emissions target is looking somewhat anachronistic. As Kevin Rudd said many years ago, before pretty much rescinding his comment, climate change is the great challenge of our generation. The National Summit on Women's Safety was held this week in Canberra. It didn't get the attention it deserved, but by the end of it, there was a concerted push from businesses and unions to introduce paid domestic violence leave. Also, a chief executive woman survey shows that there were only 10 female chief executives among the top 200 companies at the end of last financial year. A couple more have been added to the list, Meg O'Neill at Woodside and Alexis George at AMP. So that's 12 out of 200. Hardly representative of society. And didn't Western Australia's Premier Mark McGowan look happy with himself this week? Not so much the cat that ate the canary, but the feline that ate the whole aviary. He announced the state's biggest ever budget surplus amid the pandemic of $5.6 billion in increased spending on health, education, police and public servants. Oh yes, and he isn't going to open borders anytime soon. It was a big week for the economy, always is. The big one was the Reserve Bank board meeting and the statement afterwards by Governor Philip Lowe. Dr. Lowe said the current lockdowns in New South Wales, Victoria and the ACT had delayed, but not derailed, the economic recovery. The labour market will be hit and the economy will contract this quarter. But the economy will be back to its pre-Wave 2 trajectory by the middle of next year. The bank said it wouldn't up its bond purchasing program, but did extend it into next year. As my grandmother would have said, the bank's having a bob each way. Job ads fell 2.5% last month, but there's still 25% more vacancies than there was pre-pandemic. The labour market has been the shining light, and the latest data shows an unemployment rate of 4.6%. But employment figures due for release next week are likely to show a surge in that rate during August. That was the month that lockdowns hit hard. Inflation expectations have risen to their highest level in 3 years, according to the ANZ Roy Morgan Australian Consumer Confidence Survey. If people think prices are going to rise, they're more likely to ask for wage increases or expect to pay more for groceries and other goods. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. That's why policymakers watch it so closely. And the number of people holding more than one job has risen to its highest level in at least 27 years, which is when the Bureau of Statistics started the measure. During the June quarter, 6.5% of employed people had a second job. If you look at the long-term trend, it's been pretty steady. It tumbled during COVID, presumably there were fewer opportunities, and then it surged this year. Looks like people are working hard to give themselves some buffer. In corporate news, some of the country's biggest companies are becoming vocal and active about addressing the COVID crisis. Telstra wants to mandate that its 8,300 frontline staff are vaccinated by the middle of November. SPC, Qantas and Virgin have already done so. Meanwhile, the bosses of National Australia Bank and Westpac were both out this week talking up the prospects of the economy after the vaccination rate hit 70%. Qantas this week said it's handing out 15 million frequent flyer points each day to vaccinated members as part of its incentive to get people jabbed. People will only be allowed on the airline if they're vaccinated, Boss Alan Joyce said. And Woolworths is introducing rapid antigen testing at all its distribution and online fulfilment centres after a pilot program picked up 7 COVID-positive cases. We don't often, in fact we never have, spoken about military coups in African nations on Fear and Greed. But we did this week. Guinea is on the west coast of the continent and it experienced a military coup, jeopardising the operations of bauxite miners, including Rio Tinto, Alumina and Alcoa. Rio also has interest in iron ore mines in the Simandou region of the country. About 1/4 of the world's bauxite, which is used in aluminium, comes from the nation. So far, miners have been able to keep operating. So far. After weeks of discussion, Santos and Oil Search have agreed to a merger, creating a $21 billion Asian oil and gas producer, which will boost the new entity's production of both fossil fuels and clean energy. The boards and management are happy, so now the deal goes to shareholders. It emerged this week that Crown Resorts paid out its senior execs who left the company nearly $24 million, and some of them were forced out. The payouts came in a year in which Crown's application for a licence in New South Wales was knocked back. Royal commissions in Victoria and Western Australia were announced and unveiled some very poor practices, and lockdowns triggered a $261 million loss. Ken Barton, the former chief executive of whom the New South Wales Bergen inquiry said wasn't up to the job, received $6.3 million, including a $3.5 million termination payment. Crown called him a good leaver. So much for good corporate governance. Telstra boss Andy Penn made a flying visit to Papua New Guinea to talk to Prime Minister James Marape about the potential sale of Digicel, the major 3G and 4G network in the region. This is the one Canberra wants Telstra to buy to keep Chinese hands at bay. The major supermarkets are on the lookout for new staff, with more than 6,500 current employees at Woolworths, Coles and Aldi in isolation. The supermarkets need staff in distribution centres and stores. Supermarket workers are on the front line of the fight against COVID, meeting thousands of people each week. They're among the unsung heroes of the pandemic. And Macquarie Group upgraded its earnings outlook on the back of strong performances in its commodities and global markets businesses. Its share price is up 11% in the past month. Now I get to the point of the program where I go through the biggest story of the week, the sleeper story, the most remarkable story, and my favourite story. The biggest story of the week, once again, was COVID. It would be nice to be talking about something else, but that ain't going to happen before the end of this year. That's because COVID cases in New South Wales and Victoria are accelerating and likely to get worse. The race to vaccinate, didn't Prime Minister Scott Morrison say it wasn't a race? The race to vaccinate gathers pace, and Jab Czar General JJ Fruin this week said supply was no longer an issue. The biggest challenge now is the administration of the AstraZeneca and Pfizer jabs. New South Wales is leading the way thanks to extra supplies provided by the federal government over recent weeks, something Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews complained about. New South Wales' vaccination rate is close to 44% and the national rate is more than 40%. In terms of one dose, New South Wales is now beyond 76% and almost two-thirds of all eligible Australians have now had one jab. We discovered the benefits of high vaccination rates this week when New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian outlined a living with COVID world, starting about mid-October. Restrictions should be eased then, assuming a 70% full vaccination rate is achieved. Victoria will soon follow suit. Mark McGowan in Western Australia remains smug as ever, saying he isn't considering reopening his border until vax rates are between 80 and 90%. The sleeper story of the week is a bunch of stories about vaccinations. In coming months, there'll be much debate about when is a person vaccinated. My brother lives in the US and he's received the Johnson & Johnson jab. Is he vaccinated in the eyes of the federal government? What about all the students from China vaccinated with Sinovac? Are they inoculated? Can they return to Australia? Canberra this week said it would introduce vaccine passports in coming weeks to allow people to start travelling overseas again. In the fine print, the government said it was in talks with other countries to determine which vaccines will be recognised where. This is going to be a very big and a very contentious story. The most remarkable story came out of Canberra. It emerged from Freedom of Information requests that the government, in the middle of last year, delayed meeting with Pfizer about buying vaccinations. In fact, Federal Health Minister Greg Hunt's office took 6 weeks to meet with Pfizer reps, even though the US and UK had done a deal by then with a big pharmaceutical company buying in inoculations. It's easy after the fact, but at the worst of the pandemic, the government wasn't doing everything it could to secure potential vaccines. That's remarkable. As it turned out, Australia went with AstraZeneca and then did a deal with Pfizer in November last year. Our rollout has been slow, we're still in lockdowns, and the repercussions from that decision more than 14 months ago are still hurting the economy. My favourite story of the week was about online retailer Satire. Until this week, I hadn't heard of it. It's a luxury fashion retailer selling the likes of Gucci, Burberry, Fendi and Dolce & Gabbana. Amazing that a stylish fellow like myself didn't know about it. Anyway, its share price is up 40% in 2 weeks and 600% this year. It's bigger than Kogan.com. I clicked on the site and it immediately took me to the sale page. Clearly, it has some sort of data about my shopping habits already. I didn't buy the $450 polo t-shirt from Burberry, even though it was on sale. Crazy the idea that an online marketplace can soar so much so quickly. Moving on to this week's interviews, it was a cracking week of interviews kicked off on Monday by my chat to Damien Graham, Chief Investment Officer of Aware Super. He has about $150 billion under his stewardship, and he had plenty to say about the markets from climate change to cryptos. The effervescent Tim Burrows from Umbrella was my guest on Tuesday. We chatted about the financial prospects of media companies in Australia. Carlos Cacho, Chief Economist at Jarden Australia, was my guest on Wednesday. We had a great conversation about the outlook for the economy and what to expect. On Thursday, I spoke to Luke Sayers, former boss of PwC Australia, who has gone out on his own with a rapidly growing firm focused on investment, innovation and disruption. And finally, yesterday I spoke to Matthew Knott, the Washington correspondent for the Sydney Morning Herald and Age. We chatted about the State of the Union 20 years after the 9/11 attacks. Of course, that anniversary is today, and our thoughts go out to millions of people affected directly or indirectly by that barbaric act of terrorism in 2001. If you want to listen to any of the interviews or indeed any of the shows over the past week, all are available on your favourite podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. And don't forget that tomorrow I'll be back with Michael Thompson and Adam Lang from the Fear and Greed team to have a bit more of an in-depth look at some of the news around the place. I'm Sean Aylmer. Have a good Saturday and a great weekend.